And now, I think that it's time to present our rock star of this blog, directly from San Francisco. Smruti Patel leads the data platform engineering organization at Stripe. So please help me with a really nice applause and welcome Smruti.
Hey everyone, thank you Ramon for the lovely introduction. My topic for today is driving effective prioritization for our teams so you can then drive the optimal business outcomes for your users. I'm Smruti Patel and I work at Stripe. Let's say you've hired your team of very skilled, diverse engineers. You've built out your objectives and your key results. You also have your agile practices and your sprint story points. In fact, you're going above and beyond and also doing your quarterly business reviews. Everyone's shipping code. Things are peachy. And yet, in your one-on-ones, you're hearing discontent from your engineers or your managers that they can't understand how their work relates to the business. Sales is unhappy that product and engineering is not relating to customer or market trends. Stakeholders are thinking that simple features take way too long, whereas your engineering is thinking that your priorities keep changing all the time. As a result, maybe your leadership is losing some faith in your team's ability to deliver, or maybe in your own leadership. And worst of all, your users are giving up entirely on the product or the business that you support. Folks, show of hands, how many here have seen at least 3 or more of these in your lifetime here? Wow, that's a big number, about a quarter of you. Maybe 2 or more of these? Okay, at least 1 of these. All right, a sizable number. Folks, nothing to be shy. I, for one, have experienced each and every one of these in the last 15 or so years that I've been leading teams. Currently, I lead the data platform at Stripe. My group supports critical data infrastructure as Stripe is building out the global payment and treasury network, where money flows in, money flows out, your credit, fraud, risk intelligence, merchant accounting, dashboards, our own internal financial accounting products. All of this stuff runs on infrastructure and tooling that my group supports. And so as you can imagine, it's like a whirling vortex of activity on any given day. Our teams are routinely making decisions. Which KPI do I prioritize? Do I provide defense and depth across all my data systems? Or do I optimize my costs? Because it's very expensive to serve your data. Do I support my ML engineer cohort? Or do I support my go-to-market cohort? Do I focus on my own operational toil of maintaining my data infrastructure? Or do I support user-facing value? Which KPI do we prioritize? And how do we make these decisions? And what is more importantly, as leaders, as managers, how do we create that culture of agency, autonomy, and accountability while also driving value for your users? And where do you think prioritization fits into all this? To me, prioritization is that bridge which ties together business value to our own teams working in a high degree of synchrony to individual motivation. And let's see how. In my decade and a half of leading teams, the biggest lesson that I have learned is what makes each of us tick. And I strongly believe that people want to just do the right work. They want to create magic. And this is where the theory of intrinsic motivation talks about 3 things. It talks about competence, autonomy, and purpose. Competence is this ability to apply our knowledge and skills to things that are important to us. Autonomy talks about the choice and the freedom to pursue things that are important to us. And lastly, purpose. This is your North Star, like the why that drives each of us. And this is where it's important to think about opportunity cost. What do I mean by this? On any given day, we as managers and leaders know that we have fixed resources. We have so many butts and seats, as the official term goes. And so doing X implies not doing Y. And for any software-driven company, our engineering talent, their productivity, their impact is the highest leverage. If you go down a certain path and don't take something else, it could mean loss of business revenue. It could mean the road not taken. And the opportunity cost then could be very high. And then let's say you decide to change course. What do you think happens? Your engineering team starts seeing some trash as your priorities are changing. And that's where it's important to know this concept of team velocity. What do I mean by this? To me, team velocity stands for 4 things. It talks about precision. This is what are you shipping and why. Speed, which is how quickly are you able to ship your software to drive value for your users. Quality, which is it good enough? Does it really meet the rigor and the bar that you have? And lastly, impact, which is what is the business value to your users? So to me, team velocity or engineering velocity is about precision, speed, quality, and impact. And as your priorities keep changing, your team starts slowing down. And as a result, it could so happen that your leadership is losing faith in your ability as things are slowing down, or the value that you get to drive for your users gets impacted. So, as engineering managers and leaders, driving that precision into what are our teams shipping and why becomes extremely crucial to get right. Let me tell you a story. Quite recently, I was asked, "Hey, Smruti, what do you think is your most performing team, and how would you know?" So I thought about it a little, and for me, there was one team that came to mind. It was one of my teams which was mired in lots of toil. We had attrition, a lot of new engineers were also leaving. And this was a team which sat at the top of the funnel of our data infrastructure. And so it was routinely hit by multiple KPIs: efficiency, throughput, high availability, reliability, data freshness, security. They had the perfect storm of all problems. But what I saw this team do, and do really well, is over 5 quarters, they actually honed down 3 critical axes. They got their innovation just right, they got their execution solid, and they even nailed down their operations. In fact, one of their most recent ships was this very cool incremental data extraction primitive. And what is even more awesome about it is they had the foresight to strategically invest in it about a year ago, knowing that the traditional legacy system was going to hit its scaling cliff. They worked very closely with the user, and they migrated them off that old system onto new. And guess what? As we always know, we don't have the runway that we think we did. And that system, instead of keeling over about a year from now, thanks to the awesome scale that Stripe is seeing, was hitting its runway within a quarter. And so to me, what was awesome about what this team did was they were strategic in their foresight to prioritize the problem. They thoughtfully and rigorously scoped it just right, and they also went ahead and executed it in great collaboration with our users. So to me, when I think about high-performing teams, it comes down to prioritization, which is solving the right problem at the right time, and just rightly so, because we know we don't have infinite resources. And so tying it back to that bridge, prioritization then becomes that thread which ties together business value for our users, a team working in great degree of harmony and synchrony, to individual motivation, which then drives meaning and purpose for what we do and why. So you're thinking, obviously, it makes a lot of sense. Of course, we have to prioritize. But each of us knows, especially everyone in our audience who raised hands, that it's hard. It is really hard. We saw some of the symptoms of it. But what do you think are the systemic causes of why prioritization is inherently so hard? Here are a few that I have personally experienced. All right. As managers, we have fixed resources at any given point in time. And there tends to be some friction, traditionally, between the maker side of the house, this is your engineering, your product, your design, who thinks about prioritization as building that highly focused solution to drive the right impact for your users. Versus the seller side of the house, this is your revenue, your marketing, your sales, who sees prioritization as basically getting commitments to your problems, getting commitment for A, and then B, and then C, and maybe even D, which is more like the mathematical and kind of problem. And so this friction tends to manifest in different ways based on the engineering culture or the company culture that we find ourselves in. And we know that our engineers and developers are not exactly fungible. You can't move your developer from project A to B, at least at the drop of a hat. There's going to be some sunk cost associated with having them ramp up. And that comes to our own expectations of ourselves. Each of us have been engineers ourselves, and it's hard to say no. I distinctly remember a business review that I was part of. I was sitting across from our CEO, and he said, Smruti, your team is optimizing for our overall infrastructure spend. Can you build a leaderboard of our top spending teams and people who are doing well? And folks, trust me, my palms were sweating. But I looked them in the eye and I said, no, not right now. It was more critical at that point for us, my team, in a centralized capacity to optimize for in-year savings. And we said when we would be ready to drive change through other teams, we would go ahead and build that leaderboard. And we did. The interesting thing to note here is I operated in an environment where there was very, very high psychological safety. They made it easy and acceptable for me to say no. So another systemic thing that you want to be aware of is what kind of environment are you working in? Speaking of environment, a lot of us have also experienced rapid scaling. Scaling adds interesting complexities to how teams interact, how they communicate, how they collaborate. What I have experienced is typically the rule of thumb is 3x. If your teams, your users, your systems scale by an order of 3, you probably want to see what's going on. Because let's say you know how to prioritize, you've got about 5 engineers, things are great, you're sitting across from product, you know how to prioritize the right things, you're shipping code, everything's great. This may not work when you've got to 15. It will also have to change when you get to about 45, 50. And it will definitely need to change when you get to about 200. So the 3x is a good order to say, okay, when do you start having to see if your processes are working effectively? And lastly, prioritization conversations are hard conversations to have. These are some of the critical conversations where you're not really sure how to go in. And you need to be able to develop trust and empathy. And you need to have them timely. So, how do we lead this prioritization process effectively? I've seen 2 approaches. I've seen on one end of the spectrum be the top-down process, where all your executives get together, they say, here's important to me, here's what's important to me. And they come down with a list of about 40, 45 priorities, and say, maybe we can do about 43 of those. And they draw their cut line. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got this bottom-up process, where your teams and your groups are organically deciding which problems to solve. They come up with their own stack rank. Now, the interesting thing is I've seen challenges with both these approaches. In the former, quite frankly, a human brain at any given point in time can think about 7 or 8 they can remember. Also, there's no one metric to capture user satisfaction, business revenue, team health, system health, product quality, and we exhaust ourselves. Another thing to remember is if everything is important, nothing truly is. So how do you drive focus for your teams? On the other end, for the bottom-up process, this basically relates to Swiss cheesing your impact. Because think about it this way. Let's say you've got 4 teams. Each of the team has done a lot of critical thinking and rigor They've identified their stack rank, they've driven their cut line, and it makes a lot of sense to them, and they're making locally optimal decisions. But if you as a leader zoom out and you take a look at your landscape, you might realize that you peanut buttered or Swiss cheesed on the impact you want to drive for your product offering. You may realize you want to lop off things on the fringes and instead double down on your core value prop. So the Goldilocks middle that I have found be very effective in teams 2 to 200 is a 3-phased approach. This is where you provide to your teams a top-down directional framework which focuses on the why and the who. Once you have this guidance and you go to your teams, the teams then go into this bottom-up evaluation where they work with their peers, focusing on the what, the when, and the how. And then collectively, you get together as a group, reviewing the decisions you've made, the trade-offs you've made, the risks you've decided to take on, and then you commit to it and communicate, thereby effectively closing the loop. And personally, I've found applying the SPADE framework, it stands for setting, people, alternatives, decide, and explain, to be very useful through this process. So let's see, how do you actually go about implementing this framework? So in the first top-down framework, the first thing to check is the setting. As an organizational or a business leader, you first want to check where is your product or your business. At what stage is it at? Is it in the development stage, or is it in a high growth? Is it mature, or is it perhaps declining? And here, let me give you an example. For some of my group, for the big data infrastructure that I support, our users needed the non-functional aspects. They needed high security, high reliability, high availability, great data freshness. On the other hand, for the new event-driven real-time stack, our users wanted the value maximizers. They wanted very good interop between the different data APIs. And so you want to evaluate which stage you are at. And so my guidance to the group was, for the big data infrastructure, we're going to provide incremental investment and focus on these alities or the non-functionals. Whereas for the event-driven stack, we were going to start seeding transformational change so that you could be strategic about the future. Now, a thing to note here is, as a leader, if you're seeing like there are so many exciting investment opportunities, remember, you've got fixed resources, and I've found this RISE framework, which is reach, impact, confidence, and effort, to be very useful in sort of culling that problem space and saying, how do I ensure that we're investing in the right areas? So the next thing is this about the setting is the time. Look at the market trends. Look at your own competitive advantage. Look at maybe some externally imposed timelines. I distinctly remember in June 2021, the Indian government passed the data regulation, data locality regulation, and you can check it out. This was about the data of Indian citizens residing in India. And we saw that we could capitalize on this opportunity. What it did mean is, for a lot of my data teams, we had to sort of move our roadmaps to account for this work. This engineering-led initiative translated to us migrating thousands of data jobs. But we did ship on time, we were compliant in India, and it unlocked a huge business opportunity for us. It could also be that there is a brewing weakness for the area you support. For us, for data systems, we've got a wide swath of systems, a lot historic, a lot legacy, and that leads to this graveyard of unfinished migrations. And so in this case, I might want to deprecate the old to be able to accelerate on the new. Lastly, threats. Each of us here today is faced with the macroeconomic change that's happening all around us. As a result, I know there are quite a few companies who are thinking about doubling down on optimizing their infrastructure costs and driving their operational efficiency. So do your SWOT analysis to see what is the broader landscape that you're operating in. And lastly, people, people, people. At the heart of it all is our people. The users we support, the stakeholders we find ourselves working with, and the teams that support the work we do. Stripe is an extremely users-first company. And for us, know your customer becomes the heart of every prioritization conversation. So in terms of driving precision, to say, hey, what are we shipping and why? The key thing to ask is, but for whom? As an infrastructure leader, you always have a broad surface area. And it's very easy to get peanut buttered across multiple users. And so the rule I like to follow is focus on 10 happy users versus 1,000 partially unsatisfied users. And with that in mind, we actually made a hard decision recently to say we're going to deprioritize our business intelligence or go-to-market data cohort and instead double down on our ML engineers because they're adding a lot of value to the business. The next thing is stakeholders. These are your CEOs, your CROs, your CPOs, your CISOs, or heads in those organizations. Understand what matters to them. And there's a saying, do what matters to people who matter. Here's where I found the Amazon-style PR FAQ to be a very good process, especially when you're seeding new investment, to get that early feedback, to get that early alignment, and it also helps build good trust and credibility with your stakeholders. And lastly, your teams. Do an internal SWOT of your own teams. Find out who are your high performers, what are their career aspirations, what are their stretch opportunities, and then identifying what are these exciting areas of investment and who might be able to best lead it. As I was doing this exercise for my group, we realized that we lacked deep domain expertise in a critical new technology. And so to sort of mitigate for the short term, we decided to bring on an external vendor for short-term temporary relief while we ramped up hiring for this domain expertise. So figure out your people, users, stakeholders, and teams. And as a result of this, what happens then is you've zoomed out, you've seen your external landscape that you're operating in. You've evaluated your external temporal and spatial constraints. You've also decided what you're going to optimize for. Your 6 months, your 18 months, or maybe 3 years. And what comes out of this exercise then is this guidance you provide to your teams where you're ensuring that you don't zero out. What you see here is an investment portfolio of some sense. We all invest financially. This is one about how would you invest your engineering resources. And to my earlier example of big data infrastructure, where we decided to put in incremental investment to focus on security, efficiency, data productivity, scaling our business, we did a roughly 85-15 split between that big data infrastructure and the event-driven real-time stack. What I also like to do in addition to this kind of investment portfolio is a what will we not do list. We decided to not support our business intelligence cohort or third-party data integration because we didn't see the value and we also wanted to focus on our ML engineers, remember. And we decided to not build out cloud-agnostic fleet control APIs because we had decided to double down on a cloud vendor. Now, what is very interesting about this won't-do list is it not only provides this guardrails for your teams and frames that problem space, but it also gives your teams a signal that they can and should say no. And so with this top-down guidance, we go into the second phase, which is the bottom-up discovery and evaluation. Here's where you focus on the what, the when, and the how. So as an infrastructure leader, I like to ask my teams, what prioritization conversations are you going to have? Are you going to talk about a new API or a feature or a product that you're going to build out for your product engineering teams? Or are you going to depend on someone else to do some work for you, either to migrate onto your stack or because you build something off somebody else and you may get blocked? And here are some of the prioritization conversations my teams have been part of over the last 4 to 6 weeks as we get ready for our H2 roadmap and planning. I need John's team to migrate off Scalding. Yes, Shudder. For whoever knows Scalding, we still use it because it adds toil, it's costly, and it adds complexity. I need Jane to provide a bin packing API so I can build on top of that and then provide a cost-effective data platform. My CFO needs me to lower my processing costs, my data serving and storage costs. And another payments team needs me to be able to provide an API to do incremental snapshots. Now, the interesting thing to note is in each of these conversations, there are basically two parts. Either you need something from someone else and you're dependent on them, or someone else depends on you and is making an ask of you. And the thing here is you want to understand what is the shape of that ask. So you go into this phase with discovery. Here's where, let's take this case where you need something from someone else, or you're dependent on someone else. Your role here is to frame the problem, drive that clarity, focusing on the impact, which is why does it matter? You have to really convince yourself why something's important, and what happens if it doesn't get done before you go knocking on someone else's door. What do we need? And here are some prompt questions I have found useful, which is, what do we need? Why do we need it? When do we need it by? And here, the 5 whys exercise has been super useful to really convince ourselves that we indeed need something. I have an example here, which is we had one of the teams which came to us where they needed a new data analytics cluster spun up. And we didn't have the bandwidth to spin up a new one because we were incurring toil. And we said, we'll build out a general cloud management API. And as we looked around, we realized that we had another team already bootstrapping that cluster. And so we just redirected this team to team B, so to speak. What was interesting here was convincing ourselves that we indeed needed something. The next is asking what alternatives or solutions exist or have we tried. I'm a firm believer of controlling your own destiny. And so this is where, before you go knocking on someone else's door, check if you've tried everything possible. Lastly, what is the incentive model? What do I mean by this? I've led these horizontal company-wide initiatives, like lowering our infrastructure costs or reducing latency and improving performance. In such situations, before you go knocking on someone else's door and say, hey, I need you to optimize your cost, or hey, I need you to improve your performance, the thing you want to ask yourself is, what tools have you provided them that they can self-serve? Or what is in it for them? Why should they care? Why should they do this work when they have other than a million things to do? And so figure out what's the incentive model. What's your carrot? Or maybe in some cases, what's the stick? Now, on the other side, let's say someone else has something they need from you. Here, your role is to understand the problem. You want to drive learning, seek knowledge, and focus on curiosity. Asking questions like, what do they seek? What are they trying to do? And why do they seek it? Folks, I'll be transparent here. These are times when it's very easy to fall into mind traps. Team X is always asking us to do this, and they don't know how hard our lives are. But what I've learned is check yourself, be calm, be curious, like Lasso says, don't be judgmental. So open yourselves up to knowledge gathering. The next thing as you're going about this is asking what constraints exist. This is your equivalent of your CAP theorem, the good, fast, and cheap. What gives? What are your must-haves? What are your non-negotiables? So get a sense of what this is as some team is approaching you, so you get a good understanding of the space you're operating in. And lastly, who's involved? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Who might need to be consulted for this problem if you don't have all the data you need? And who might need to be informed because they might be affected? Let's say you're rolling out a change like a backward incompatible API, or you've decided to deprecate an old data system. Who might be affected? So get a sense of all of this. This is your first stage of discovery. The output at the end of this is your mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. It's called a MECI list of all the things that your team could work on. Your prioritized user asks, your historic backlog, and also your team's own operational toil-related strategic investments. So take a look at your operational metrics as well and see what you could be solving. Now let's say you take this MECI list of everything you could do. What is the next thing? Again, fixed resources, so you've got to cut down your problem space because you need your cut line. This is where you're figuring out your alternatives. Here you're assessing your options and the trade-offs you have to make such that you and the team that you're dependent on can get to this mutually shared, globally right outcome for the business and the users. But before you do that, first internalize and acknowledge the problem. Do I truly believe that this is a problem that needs to be solved? Remember the data analytics example I gave. We didn't really need to solve it. What are some of the hard and soft constraints? Here's where what I found useful is sort of plotting the problem space between urgent and important helps you sort of contain some of the scope there. And if you've chosen to optimize your constraints, figure out what you can choose to not really do. And if you choose to not do something, what are the downstream risks for that team or for you if you choose to not go down that path? Now, once you've figured out your constraints, talk about scope. How can you scope your problem just right? And here's where this 2x2 matrix of ease of execution and impact can be very useful. Identify ways to find out, can you go 80% of the way and front load the impact and maybe have a plan B for the last long tail of 20. Now let's say you evaluated your constraints, you evaluated your scope, and nothing really gives. So the next thing then is to get creative about your resourcing. Can you ring fence your engineers to solve the problems or the priorities that you do want to invest in? Or maybe you realize that there's a way to sort of get a squad-like model where you pick the right strategic folks for some critical portions of your project. And once you've done that, what you now have is a contained list of 2 to 3 options for what you're planning to do, your risk evaluation, your trade-offs, and associated costs of each. Now, this was when someone was dependent on you. Now, let's say you were dependent on someone else. In this evaluation phase, your role is not to put your feet up and twiddle your thumbs. What you want to do is figure out what's your plan B. What happens if something didn't get delivered? I, for one, am a plan C kind of person, so I at least like to ensure that there's a plan B that's set up. And one exercise I've found useful is to do things like backcasting or pre-mortems. What do I mean by this? For backcasting, imagine the outcome that you want. Imagine this, what success looks like. And then work backward to figure out what has to be true along the way for that outcome to be achieved. And on the other hand, something that I've also found useful is the pre-mortem exercise, where imagine something's failed, and you're working backward to figure out what could go wrong along the way. I'll give you an example. About a year or so ago, we were implementing data governance controls across our data systems. We've got about 20 to 25 data systems we've collected over the last 10 years. And as we were implementing the control, for one control, we were stuck on this one team where we said, hey, we need you to migrate your data from one bucket to another. Could you do this for us? And with good reason, they had other higher priorities, and they couldn't. So I said, okay, how do we make this work? We went back and pivoted our approach from having detective controls to preventative. And the interesting thing is, in the short term, we added a lot more scope. However, we also had short-term user relief, but long-term, we actually improved the scenario for our own teams because the toil would have been higher with the first approach. So the thing to note here is when you are dependent on someone else, figure out what your plan B is if it does or does not land. So to summarize, this is the bottom-up proposal where each of your teams have taken your top-down guidance. They've worked with your peer teams. They've internalized and acknowledged that there is a problem. They've reframed it in terms of your constraints, efforts, and the outcomes. You've also done your risk and trade-off assessment to say what's going to happen if you choose to do or not do. And if you were dependent on someone else, you've done your backcasting and your pre-mortems to make sure you've got a solid plan B. And you've also come up now with a list of things that your team is going to do and what your cut line is. So folks, you're now ready for phase 3. This is the last phase where you now are going into this organizational leader mode, where you're going to review each of the bottom-up proposals. You're going to zoom out and remember the product business setting. You're going to remember your spatial temporal constraints. You remember what you were optimizing for. And you're going to review each of these to see if you've built the right strategic and tactical balance. I find this step very useful because it's not only good tactically to provide direction for your teams, but also provides strategic alignment with your users and stakeholders, which then helps build trust and credibility. So what does review look like? This is where you're doing a sniff test of sorts for each of your teams to say, have they struck the right balance? What are the big boulders they want to move? What are the tactical compromises they're making or the short-term impact? But also your strategic future investment to make sure that you can manage your teams sustainably and durably while providing value to users. As you can imagine, data platform is always implicated in each and every one of our company priorities. And I have had to make some really hard trade-offs over the past cycles. Some of the hardest trade-offs have been pivoting teams off their existing charters to focus on other high-priority projects because I didn't have other ways of resourcing them. I had to shelve some bottom-up projects because they had relatively low return on investment for the short term, while they may have been useful over a 4-year horizon. I've also had to say no to our users taking calculated risks that some of our users, like the BI cohort, is likely going to churn because we can't support them. And then the last one, which I'm never unhappy about, which is prioritizing security and defense and depth security over short-term increase in our costs for our users. So once you've reviewed your bottom-up proposal, you're basically going into the decision mode where you're making sure that you communicate to your users. This is very critical because you're now being intentional about the trade-offs you're making and you're aligning yourself with your stakeholders. What does this look like? This basically looks like a document where you're summarizing what are the top 2-3 boulders you're going to drive? What is the impact you're going to have? What options have you considered? What trade-offs are you going to make? What are you explicitly not going to solve? And what are the downstream risks of not solving there, along with some potential mitigations? And you then take this, make that decision, and communicate it so you close the loop with your execs and stakeholders. All right, folks, zooming out, we've talked about the importance of driving effective prioritization conversations. We saw what makes it hard, but necessary. And we also saw how to apply the SPADE framework, which is setting, people, alternatives, decide, and explain recursively for our teams and group of teams. But the most important thing I'd like you to take away and that I have learned is to just have the prioritization conversation. Make the time and create the space for it. And as you're having these, drive clarity and acknowledge that sometimes these are not easy conversations to have, but they do need to be had and had timely. And to do that, build partnerships with your users, your stakeholders, and your own teams so you can then lead with trust and empathy. And a key thing there is then to be adaptable and resilient. Remember, do not lose sight of the big picture. There are times when your priorities may not be in your control, so be adaptable to changing your metrics if you really have to. So they are an imperfect tool. And lastly, please be explicit about the decision. Own it as hard as it might be, because that's what we as leaders do. And make sure you communicate it to your users, execs, and stakeholders. Lastly, effective prioritization is extremely crucial for driving focus for our users, shared alignment for our teams and organizations, and most importantly, having a global optima for our users and the business. Thank you. Too late? Thank you, folks. Questions?
Thank you so much for this really nice speech. I wonder if anyone in the audience have any question. We have this Slido, and you can put any kind of question for Smruti today. Well, meanwhile, something is popping up. I have one question for you.
Yes.
I believe that Stripe is a well-known service from different kind of companies. Could you please highlight any kind of activity where you need to prioritize two big or really demanding activities and how you do it? there?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and that is me every single day. So I work in infrastructure, and we support this infrastructure in favor of product teams. And so we have a very tight coupling between product and infrastructure. And so the things that I think about, two big ones which recently came up, and I talked about it, was how do you drive efficiency across all data systems, but at the same time enforce security so that the access to data is secure, is governed, and is compliant because Stripe operates globally. So internally within the teams, we had to pick between security and efficiency. But from the product side, the example I gave around data locality was a big one, where we said, hey, as a product, as a business, we want to expand into India. So how do you make room for Indian data locality? And that then required my teams to figure out security efficiency and India data locality and say, how do you sort of balance the market opportunity with this inherent sort of operating the business and doing it well? And zooming out, every single day, product teams are also going through similar prioritization.
Awesome, that's great. That's great, great, great. Well, yeah, we have another two. So one is, how does this framework that is based on decision and commit to them relate to a more dynamic approach like build, measure, learn cycle?
Okay. That again is a very good question. To me, when I think about the build, measure, learn cycle, it is a very tight feedback loop which addresses the inner feedback loop of dev, test, deploy. It is at the level and the granularity of a certain piece of code or software. Where the decision making comes in is more at the macro level, which is what are you even shipping? So if you think about team velocity, I talked about precision, speed, quality, and impact. And the build, measure, learn cycle of DevOps targets the speed and the quality very tightly. What it doesn't cover for too much is, are you even solving the right problem? And that's where some of the decisions and commitment comes in, where you have external market factors, your business product strategy, or different stakeholders that you think about. So it's more at the macro level, plus complemented with the build, test, deploy.
Great. Okay, let's jump for the next one.
Yeah.
It's like, what are ring-fenced teams?
Beautiful. This is, I should patent it. It's my own concept. Basically, when you're operating in something, the environment that I am, where you tend to have a lot of priorities and those priorities themselves keep changing, some of the infrastructure problems last multiple quarters or even multiple years. So what do you do when you are in this third quarter of solving a problem and boom, a new priority comes in and says, all right, move these engineers off this problem onto another one. You might realize you don't have the luxury to do so, but you want to see that thing through because you indeed believe that it is a multi-year problem. And that's where this concept of ring fencing comes in, which is you carve out those people and say the overall capacity minus these capacity is what we now have for any future priorities. The main idea here is how do you secure ongoing funding for long-running projects and investments which you do believe is needed for the group. Having said that, you do want a checkpoint that the state hasn't changed enough where that itself ceases to be a priority.
Awesome. And let's go for the last, where something disappeared there. Okay, I think that we need to cut out.
Okay.
Wait here, just 10 seconds. I have something for you. So thank you so much for this. Let's give applause for Smruti, please.
Thank you. Thanks, folks. Thank you for sitting around and having patience.
Welcome to
Thank you.
Budapest.